The lamps flicker, the room smells faintly of iodine, and a husband leans across the table to whisper his wife's name. She tilts her head, smiles politely, and calls him stranger. Her eyes are calm, her posture steady, her body unbroken, yet something essential has been cut from her. This was no madness, no accident. It was deliberate. It was the signature of Dr. Alton Greene, the man who treated memory not as sacred, but as a disease. What would it mean if the core of who you are, your love, your grief, your history, could be stripped away with 2 small cuts at the temples? What would it mean if the past itself could be excised like infected flesh? In the gaslit corridors of a Pennsylvania asylum in the early 1870s, one physician did precisely that. He carved into the minds of men and women, left their bodies alive and functional, but erased the connections that made them human. Administrators called it therapy, families called it horror, and Greene himself wrote only 2 words in every ledger: removal, successful. This is not a story about medicine, this is a story about power, because to sever memory is to sever identity, to erase the past is to control the future. Greene was not merely a doctor, he was an architect of silence, building a ward of people emptied of their own lives, standing as evidence of what can happen when institutions declare that memory is an illness. And the most chilling truth is this: his notes did not die with him. His handwriting appears again, decades later, long after his disappearance, identical, unbroken. Who was holding the pen? To understand Greene, you must first understand the world that created him. The 19th century asylum was not a sanctuary, but a theater of control. These were not hospitals as we imagine them, but factories of obedience where society sent its inconvenient, the grieving, the eccentric, the unwanted. Once demitted, they were no longer patients, they were property. And Greene, with his surgical calm, was the perfect servant of that system. He did not rage against his subjects, nor even console them. He observed, recorded, and cut. Always the same incision, always the same result. Identity reduced to absence. What frightened witnesses most was not cruelty, but precision. Greene's patients were not mutilated or left screaming. They were composed, compliant, polite. They ate meals, walked the halls, obeyed instructions, but when asked their names, their pasts, their families, there was nothing. Only the present tense remained. I am here. I eat, I sit, I walk. A human body reduced to the grammar of survival. And Greene saw this not as tragedy, but triumph. He believed he had cured them of memory's infection. Ask yourself, what would it mean if memory could be treated like disease? Would your grief be gone? Yes. Would your pain be erased? Yes. But what of the love that gave the grief its shape? What of the children whose laughter you recall, the father's words that still echo, the moments that form the thread of you? Greene's knife severed not pain but personhood itself. The most haunting document from those years is not Greene's own ledger, but a single letter from a visitor. A husband, writing after he left the asylum in silence. Her face was hers, her hands were hers, but when she looked at me, she looked as if I were paper. That is the terror of Greene's work. He did not kill people, he erased them. He left their shells intact and called it cure. But here is where the unease deepens. Greene's handwriting, cold and exact, continues to appear in institutional records long after his disappearance in 1876. Reports surface as late as the 1890s, signed in the same steady hand, closing with the same 2 words: removal successful. Was it Greene? Or had his method been absorbed, replicated, institutionalized by others who believed in memory as infection? Because once an idea takes root in an institution, it rarely dies. It is passed down, renamed, concealed under new headings. Greene may have vanished, but his doctrine lived on in silence. This is the descent you're about to take, not into blood, but into absence, not into madness, but into obedience manufactured by scalpel. You're about to see how a single doctor's obsession with memory as disease became a weapon of control, and how families, desperate, pleading, abandoned, were erased alongside the patients they loved. And I must warn you, once you hear this story, you cannot unknow it. The ledger of Greene is not just history. It is a mirror, a warning about how easily identity can be declared expendable when institutions grow hungry for order. So lean in closer. You're not supposed to be here. You were never supposed to hear this. But now that you are here, now that you have opened the ledger with me, there is no turning back. Tonight, we begin the descent into the asylum of Dr. Alton Greene, and once you see what he did, you will understand why silence is sometimes the loudest form of horror. The first incision was small, scarcely more than an inch, a neat cut at the temple, where the thin bone of the skull lies just beneath the skin. To the eye it appeared trivial, but Greene's notes record it with ritual precision. Bilateral incision, ons, symmetrical, 2 sutures each side, dressing applied, carbolic lint, result satisfactory. Clinical language stripped of humanity, as if he were describing repairs on a machine. What followed was always the same. The patient awoke, not broken, not screaming, but emptied. They would eat, walk, even laugh faintly when prompted. But when their families arrived, when mothers called the names of children, when husbands whispered the words of shared years, the response was silence. A polite tilt of the head, a faint smile as though meeting a stranger on the street. And Greene would write, with the cold finality of scripture, removal successful. You must understand the world in which this was permitted. The asylum was an empire of silence. Its wards were ruled not by medicine but by administration. Superintendents wanted results that could be tallied, measured, filed. Families sent letters pleading for cures, and what administrators craved most was paperwork that suggested improvement. If the violent were calmed, if the grieving ceased to cry out, if the troublesome grew docile, that was cure enough. It did not matter what had been taken from them to achieve it, and Greene gave them results. Perfect results. Patients who no longer screamed, no longer clung to grief, no longer resisted. He offered not healing, but subtraction. And in the mathematics of institutions, subtraction looked like progress. The nurses saw it first. They recorded the scars, thin, deliberate, always in the same place. They noted the symmetry, the consistency, the impossibility of chance. One nurse, methodical and terrified, began drawing them into her notebook. Beside each patient's number, she sketched 2 faint lines, parallel strokes across the temples, and beneath, always the same observation, speech absent. In the margins of her ledger, she wrote one phrase over and over, as though trying to convince herself of its meaning: therapeutic incision. The word therapeutic hung like a shroud over the horror, because what is therapy, if not a justification for intrusion? Greene had wrapped his scalpel in the language of cure, and in doing so he concealed his crimes within the very institution meant to prevent them. But the families were not fooled. They wrote letters that still survive in state archives, brittle pages inked with confusion, disbelief, despair. A farmer's wife from Lancaster wrote, "He smiled at me as though I were a neighbor, but when I spoke of our children, he asked me whose boys they were. I beg you, what has been done?" Another letter, from a daughter. She calls me stranger. I placed in her hands the scarf she stitched for me when I was 12, but she looked upon it as though it were new. She denies me as if I were never born. Each letter strikes the same wound. They came seeking healing, and what they found instead was erasure. Their loved ones were present, alive, sitting across from them, but emptied of recognition, emptied of the very memories that bound family together. To look into their eyes was to see a body inhabited by absence. And still, Greene wrote only, removal successful. Do you see what is happening here? This is not just about one doctor's obsession, this is about the silence of systems. Greene's superiors received the letters, they read the complaints, they saw the pleas, and yet the replies, when they came at all, were formulaic. Patient condition satisfactory, visitation permitted, improvement noted. Bureaucracy crushed grief beneath the weight of procedure, and this is the pattern you must begin to recognize, because it has never gone away. Institutions do not need to hide their crimes in blood. They hide them in silence. They hide them in paperwork. They redefine horror as progress, and once redefined, it becomes invisible. Greene's ledger is only an early example of a doctrine that has plagued human history. Erase the past, control the present, and call it healing. But perhaps the most chilling detail lies not in the scars themselves, but in the voices of the patients after the knife. When spoken to, they answered always in the present tense. I am here, I sit, I eat, I walk. Never a memory, never a past. It was as if Greene had stripped not just recollection, but time itself from their minds. They lived only in the now, as if the past had been excised and the future was forbidden. And Greene did not argue morality. He never defended his methods with passion. He did not claim benevolence or plead ignorance. He simply wrote, again and again, with the precision of a clock. Removal successful. He believed memory was infection, and infection must be cut away. The deeper terror is this. He may have been right in one sense. Because patients no longer cried, they no longer screamed in grief. They were calm, composed, compliant. In Greene's world, that was cure. But in truth, it was the annihilation of the person, the carving away of everything that makes us human. This is why Greene's work is so dangerous to remember, because it reveals how thin the line truly is between cure and control, between therapy and tyranny. Once you convince a system that identity itself is pathology, anything can be cut away in the name of progress, and Greene was only the beginning. By the spring of 1872, the asylum had grown quieter, not peaceful, not healed, but quiet in a way that unsettled even the attendants. One ward in particular, Ward C, earned whispers among staff. They called it the blank ward, not officially, not in the records. On paper it was listed as just another wing of the institution, but everyone who walked those halls knew it was different. Imagine rows of patients seated upright at long wooden tables, men and women of every age, their heads wrapped in narrow linen bands, their temples marked by thin scars, always in the same place, always the same length. They ate their meals with mechanical calm, lifting spoons in unison, chewing with identical rhythm. No conversation, no complaints, no laughter. Only the faint clink of tin spoons against enamel bowls. One matron later confessed in her private diary, "It was not the silence that frightened me most. It was the absence of preference. They accepted what was given without question, bread or broth, thin blanket or thick, coarse garment or soft. It made no difference. They showed no choice. They showed no want. The air was heavy with nothing. That was Greene's true creation. Not cured patients, but a population emptied of history, emptied of desire. They lived only in the present tense, stripped of the very continuity that makes a human life. I am here. I sit. I eat. I walk. That was all. Nurses noted that when spoken to, these patients responded politely, sometimes even with faint smiles. But when asked about the past, their names, their families, their childhoods, the answers dissolved into bewildered silence. When asked if they remembered, they would simply say, I am here. When asked if they had children, they would respond, I eat, as though the scalpel had severed not only memory but grammar itself, leaving them stranded in the eternal present. Administrators praised the ward. These patients caused no trouble, resisted no treatment, demanded no attention. Their charts filled with neat check marks, appetite regular, no agitation, orientation absent. To the bureaucrat, rats, it was a miracle. Dozens of patients who once screamed with grief or raged with confusion now sat in docile order, easy to manage, easy to file. The ledger entries multiplied, removal successful, removal successful, removal successful. But among the attendants, whispers grew. They spoke of visiting families leaving in tears, clutching the hands of loved ones who no longer knew them. They spoke of a weight in the air, an emptiness that clung to the skin like damp plaster. One porter, delivering firewood, wrote years later, "They looked like people who had come back from somewhere without their names. Their eyes followed me, but it was as if I were the first thing they had ever seen. The blank ward was not a ward of healing. It was a ward of subtraction. Each patient was a hollowed vessel, moving through routine without recollection, stripped of the thread that bound them to themselves." Greene did not see horror here. He saw perfection. He described the ward in one surviving report as an environment of tranquility, free from the disturbances of recollection. And yet, beneath the silence, a darker pattern emerged. The patients of Ward C all bore the same phrase in their files, written in Greene's steady hand: retains function, absent recollection. 23 patients listed in sequence, each line closing with the identical words. The repetition was so precise, so mechanical, that when laid side by side, the words aligned down the page like teeth in a gear. It was more than medical notation. It was doctrine. Greene was not experimenting. He was building a model, a reproducible method for manufacturing obedience, one incision at a time. Consider the implications. A ward of men and women who no longer resisted, no longer remembered, no longer asked questions. A ward that required fewer attendants, fewer interventions, fewer resources. To administrators balancing budgets, it was efficiency. To Greene, it was proof of theory. To families, it was devastation. And to history, it is a warning of how easily institutions accept emptiness as success. One nurse's sketches survive. Simple pencil drawings, crude but haunting. Ovals of faces with no features, only the two short lines where temples should be. Beneath one sketch, she copied Greene's phrase, therapeutic incision, and beneath that, in a smaller hand, she wrote, every scar was cut the same way, precise, clean, as if erasing pain could be done with a blade. This is what makes Greene's legacy so sinister. He was not a monster in the sense we imagine. He did not revel in cruelty or gore. He did not torture for pleasure. He cut with calm, with precision, with conviction. He believed he was doing good. And that belief, that quiet certainty, is what makes his ward more terrifying than any chamber of screams. Because it reveals how horror thrives not in chaos, but in order, not in madness, but in silence. The blank ward grew. More patients were assigned, more families left in despair, and Greene's ledgers filled with the same two words, stamped across human lives like the seal of a machine. Removal successful. Here is the question you must confront. Was this simply a doctor's obsession, or was it the first step towards something far more deliberate, the use of medicine not to heal, but to control? Because once you see what Greene built in Ward C, you will understand that memory itself can be treated as contraband, and when memory becomes contraband, obedience becomes law, and in that silence, in that obedience, institutions flourish. To understand the horror of the blank ward, you must step into the mind of the man who created it. Dr. Alton Greene was not a butcher, not a madman raving in shadows. He was something colder, a physician of calculation. A man whose obsession with order was hidden in plain sight, written in ledgers, disguised as therapy. His official personnel file is unremarkable. Hired in 1870, trained at the University of Pennsylvania, listed as a specialist in neurological disorders, his salary noted in neat columns, his quarters assigned, his signature filed away with no flourish. Nothing in that bureaucratic portrait suggests monstrosity. Yet the fragments that survive, notes, journals, testimony from staff, reveal a man consumed not with healing, but with subtraction. Greene's published papers, circulated only within obscure institutional journals, bear titles that read less like medical texts and more like mathematical proofs. On the removal of persistent recollection in the melancholic state, 1871. On the surgical isolation of memory from emotional response, 1872. They are written without emotion, without metaphor. Memory is never described as treasure, never as soul, never as the thread of identity. It is framed only as pathology, something to be measured, dissected, excised. In one paper, Greene compares grief to a gangrenous limb. That which cannot heal, he writes, should be cut away, lest it infect the whole. He describes memory of trauma not as a wound to be tended, but as rot to be removed. In another, he speaks of the elimination of recollection as a necessary relief. He calls memory a host of infection. The word repeats, infection, as if to remember is to sicken. This was his doctrine, that memory is disease and forgetting is cure. Staff who observed him describe a man of unsettling composure. One matron wrote, "He speaks less than others. He will ask one question and then leave you to fill the silence." He writes constantly, even during meals. His eyes grey, his manner cold, he seems not to tire. A nurse recalled his rounds. He carried no air of kindness nor cruelty. He was only distant, as if weighing what to keep and what to discard in every sentence spoken. He was not sadistic. He did not mock his patients, nor taunt their families. He was worse. He was detached, and detachment, when placed in the hands of institutions, is the perfect soil for atrocity. But the deepest glimpse into his psyche lies not in his words, but in his handwriting. Every file attributed to Greene concludes the same way: patient number, procedure, brief notes, and always, without fail, the same closing phrase: removal successful. The handwriting is steady, compact, perfectly upright. No wavering strokes, no hurried loops. Each entry measured as though drawn with a ruler, and always the words aligned at the margin, identical in placement, identical in form. When files are laid side by side, the words descend like the teeth of a machine. This was not habit, it was ritual. One porter described Greene late at night, bent over his papers, lips moving silently as he wrote. He copied the phrase as if it were a prayer, the man recalled. When blotches marred the ink, Greene rewrote the entire entry to preserve the purity of those two words. When fading dulled the letters, he traced them darker, refusing their erosion. It is as if the phrase itself was his scripture, his creed. Removal successful, not merely documentation, but invocation. Consider the implications. Greene did not see himself as cutting flesh. He saw himself as cutting infection, purifying the body by excising memory. In his doctrine, he was not harming his patient. Hence, he was saving them. And in writing those words again and again, he was reassuring himself that his scalpel had done its holy work. But the horror does not end with his conviction. It extends to the system that embraced it. Administrators saw the ledgers, saw the patients calm and docile, and they believed him. They accepted the phrase without question. They stamped his methods as therapeutic. They filed his results under miscellaneous neurological. And in doing so, they sanctified the erasure of identity. This is the truth that institutions never want you to see. Evil does not always wear blood on its hands. Often it wears a ledger. Often it writes in neat columns. Often it repeats the same phrase until it becomes unchallengeable. Greene's work was not hidden in shadows. It was written in plain daylight, stacked on shelves, stamped and sealed by men who wanted silence more than truth. And the silence spreads, because his handwriting appears again, years later, long after Greene's disappearance in 1876. In records from other wards, in reports filed under new names, but always with the same closing words: removal successful. The same exact script, perfectly identical. What does that mean? Was Greene alive, continuing his work under a shroud of new appointments, or was his doctrine absorbed by others, his phrase becoming institutional law, copied mechanically by those who inherited his methods? In either case, the handwriting tells you the same thing. Greene never ended. The scalpel was only the beginning. You see now why this story is dangerous, because once you realize how easily memory itself can be declared infection, you begin to see the ledgers of silence everywhere, in schools that erase histories, in governments that classify truths, in families that bury their scandals. Greene was not anomaly. He was mirror. And if you have followed me this far, you are already changing, because to hear this story is to see through the veil of silence. And once you see, you cannot go back. Between 1872 and 1876, the asylum's correspondence clerk preserved a bundle of papers that still lies folded in the state archive. The ink has browned, the creases are stiff, but the words cut deeper than any scalpel. These were not notes from doctors. They were not ledgers from Greene. They were letters, the last cries of families who watched their loved ones erased in Ward C. The earliest letters begin with disbelief. A farmer's wife from Lancaster County writes in careful, pleading script. When I called his name, he smiled as at a neighbor, but not as at a spouse. He ate with me as though it were the first meal of our union. But when I spoke of our children, he asked me whose boys they were. I beg you, what has been done? A daughter from Wilkes-Barre writes, she calls me stranger, though I raised her. I placed in her hands the scarf she stitched for me when I was 12, but she looked upon it as if new. She denies me as though I were never born. A brother from Alton writes, he knows the hymn, he sings the words, but when I tell him we sang it together as children, he denies knowledge of me. I beg you, restore him to me. These words bleed with confusion, with hope. They believe, at least at first, that some mistake has been made, that medication has clouded the senses too. Exhaustion has dulled the memory. But as the years pass, the tone changes. By 1873, anger sharpens their sentences. A husband, bitter with grief, writes, "If this is treatment, then you have taken from me what illness never had. You have cut away her vow. Tell me then, sir, what marriage is this?" Another writes with fury, "If you call this cure, then you are not doctors, you are thieves. You have stolen what was mine by covenant. Return her to me, or admit that you have ended her without death." But still, Greene's replies never come. Administrators send formulaic acknowledgements. Patient condition satisfactory. Improvement noted. Visitation permitted as scheduled. Each letter reduces grief to clerical dust. And then comes the silence. By 1875, the pleas dwindle. Letters become shorter, resignation creeping into every line. A daughter writes, "She is gone to me. I will not return." A father, "If she no longer remembers me, then I no longer recognize her." By 1876, the correspondence dries to almost nothing. The archive is left with brittle pages stained by grief, filed away under a cold heading, miscellaneous inquiries. That phrase alone reveals the cruelty of institutions. Generations of love erased in a column, reduced to administrative residue. What makes these letters unbearable is not just their grief, but their progression. They begin with hope, turn to rage, and collapse into silence. The families themselves are erased, not by knife, but by despair. The system did not only strip patients of memory, it stripped families of voice. And Greene. His ledgers make no mention of these letters. His files continue with the same refrain: removal successful. There is no acknowledgement, no regret, no defense, only silence. But here is the truth you must face. This silence is not unique to one asylum, one doctor, one century. This is how institutions devour. They erase not through violence alone, but through paperwork, through the slow suffocation of unanswered letters, through the burying of grief beneath categories and stamps. They redefine horror until no one resists it. Do you see how dangerous this becomes? Families begged for answers, but their words were filed away, ignored, left to rot. And in their absence, Greene's doctrine flourished. He was free to continue, free to cut, free to stamp each life with the same words: removal successful. Think of what that means. Dozens of lives emptied, dozens of families silenced. And no matter how many letters arrived at the asylum gates, the answer was always the same: silence. This is why you must understand. Greene's horror was never his alone. It was systemic. He thrived because silence was profitable, because docile patients were efficient, because absence was easier to manage than grief. And that silence echoes forward in history, in every institution that erases the cries of those who dare to ask why. Halfway through this story, I want you to do something with me. Go to the comments and write the phrase, "Silence is control." Write it twice. Because that is the key Greene left us. That is the truth institutions never want you to see. Silence is not neutral. Silence is the sharpest weapon of all. And once you write it, you will remember it. You will see it everywhere, in the letters unanswered, in the truths buried, in the voices that never return. The families were silenced, the patients were erased, the ledgers were stamped, and Greene's hand continued to move, as if nothing had happened at all. In the autumn of 1876, Dr. Alton Greene vanished. No obituary, no body, no notice of resignation. One day his name was on the staff ledger. The next it was absent, his quarters reassigned without explanation. Administrators noted only the word vacated. There were no investigations, no articles in the local press, not even a formal announcement to the families whose loved ones still sat in Ward C, staring blankly at their hands, repeating in polite tones, "I am here." Greene slipped into silence as neatly as his handwriting filled a ledger. But his disappearance was not the end. It was only the next chapter of the horror, because his handwriting did not vanish with him. In the asylum's archives, files from the late 1870s and 1880s begin to show a familiar pattern. Reports signed under different staff names, different wards, even different institutions. And yet in the margins of those files, at the bottom of case notes, there appears the same phrase, written in the exact same hand: removal successful. The words are identical, perfectly aligned, perfectly measured, the same compact, upright script. Handwriting experts reviewing these files decades later declared it impossible. No variation, no fatigue, no tremor of age. It was as though the pen itself had been guided by mechanical force. What does that mean? Did Greene survive his disappearance, continuing his work in secrecy? Did he slip into new institutions under false identities, replicating his method wherever bureaucracies allowed him to flourish? Or worse, had his doctrine outlived him, carried on by others who copied not only his method but his very hand? Consider that possibility carefully, because handwriting is not merely text, it is identity, movement, rhythm of the body. To see Greene's hand replicated decades after his disappearance is to suggest something more chilling, that his doctrine was no longer tied to one man, but had become systemic. His words had been absorbed into the institution itself, copied until they no longer belonged to him alone. And here lies the darker truth. Institutions do not need men like Greene forever. They only need the method. Once the method is codified, once the silence is profitable, the individual disappears and the machine carries on. Greene was only the architect. The asylum became the cathedral. Reports from as late as 1894, found in a separate Pennsylvania facility, contain patient files describing small symmetrical incisions at the temples, patients living in the present tense, families bewildered by polite strangers, and always, at the end of the notes, in that same identical script, removal successful. Who was writing it? Was it Greene, returned like a ghost? Or had his phrase become a stamp, passed down from one doctor to the next like a signature of compliance? The records never say. The files offer no explanation. They only repeat. And repetition is the mark of doctrine. Do you see it now? Greene may have disappeared in 1876, but he had already achieved what every manipulator of history craves. His silence became contagious. His handwriting became immortal. He had transformed erasure into ritual. And once ritual takes hold in institutions, it does not die, it spreads, it replicates, it appears decades later in identical strokes, as if memory itself is being scrubbed by the hand of something larger than man. There is one account buried in a matron's diary from the 1880s that chills more than any ledger. She writes, "I never met Dr. Greene, yet I have seen his hand. It appears on slips in the night. We leave blank charts for the morning, and by dawn they are filled, signed with words none of us dare to question. Removal successful. I cannot say who writes them, for no one admits it, but the words are always there. This is the forbidden territory we enter now, because Greene's disappearance raises not relief but dread. His silence was not an ending, it was a multiplication. He did not need to survive in flesh, he survived in ink. And ask yourself how many lives were erased after his name was gone. How many families were left bewildered in visiting rooms, begging questions that no one answered. How many charts were stamped with his words, even when his face was no longer present. This is how corruption truly survives, not in individuals but in rituals, not in blood but in bureaucracy. Greene may have vanished, but his method became invisible law. And invisible laws are the most dangerous of all, because no one knows who enforces them, and everyone fears to question. Think carefully about what I'm saying, because this story is not about one asylum, one doctor, one set of families lost in the 1870s. It is about the way silence multiplies, the way institutions replicate atrocity in perfect handwriting until no one remembers the origin. And if Greene's words survive beyond him, then ask yourself this: where else have they traveled? Into what other ledgers, what other files, what other doctrines that call erasure therapy and silence cure? You were never supposed to ask that question. And now that you have, you are beginning to see. By the late 1870s, Ward C no longer felt like a hospital. It felt like a theater of absence. Attendants spoke of walking its halls as though passing through a graveyard, not because the patients were dead, but because their identities had been buried while their bodies still moved. Imagine this: 24 men and women, seated in orderly rows at long wooden benches, eating in silence. Every spoon rises, every spoon falls with mechanical precision. No voices, no arguments over rations, no laughter at small jokes. Just the faint clink of metal against enamel. To watch them, attendants said, was to see the human soul reduced to clockwork. One matron wrote privately in her log, "It is not madness that chills me, it is the uniformity. They show no preference for food or garment. They do not complain. They do not resist. They do not even appear bored. They simply accept, as if they were machines built to endure without question." This was Greene's masterpiece. A ward where individuality had been erased so thoroughly that choice itself seemed to have been cut away. Patients wore whatever was given, ate whatever was placed before them, walked wherever they were guided. They left no trace of themselves, no memory, no protest. Their lives became a series of disconnected presents, one meal, one step, one breath at a time. And yet, there were moments that revealed the horror more clearly than silence ever could. One nurse described kneeling beside a woman of 34, admitted years earlier for what was called melancholia. The nurse asked her gently, "Do you remember your family?" The woman tilted her head, eyes calm, and replied, "I am here." The nurse pressed, "Do you know your children?" Again the patient smiled faintly and said, "I eat." The questions went on, but the answers never changed. Always polite, always present tense, always without past. This is the subtlety of Greene's work. He had not created monsters. He had not created corpses. He had created polite strangers, emptied vessels who moved through the world with calm obedience. And to administrators that was perfection. To families it was devastation. The inventories of the ward reveal the chilling uniformity. Each patient consumed the same portion of broth, left behind the same fraction of bread, never asked for more or less. Each accepted their linens and clothing without objection, never requesting change, never expressing discomfort. The requisition forms list them with terrifying efficiency. Ward C, no objections noted. One attendant described walking the ward during supper, the air heavy with nothing. 20 faces looked up at me, but it was as if I were the first thing they had ever seen. I wanted to run, for their eyes clung to me not with recognition, but with emptiness. It was like being stared at by mirrors that reflected nothing back. Here is where the true horror lies. Not in blood, not in screams, but in subtraction. Greene had stripped away not the body, but the thread that ties body to history. He had proven, at least to himself, that identity was not sacred. It could be cut, erased, deleted. What remained was a ward of functioning shells, human only in shape. And you must understand, this was not hidden. It was not concealed in secret basements or forbidden chambers. It was displayed in ledgers, recorded in files, approved by supervisors. The silence of the ward was its own defense. There were no riots, no cries to investigate, no disturbances to alarm the public. Patients sat in rows, compliant, and the institution called it success. But attendants knew better. They whispered of the atmosphere that clung like a disease. They spoke of a heaviness that made the ward difficult to breathe in. One wrote, "They do not resist, but neither do they live. It is as though the room itself has been emptied of time. I feel as if I am walking among the dead who forgot they had died." Think of what this means. Greene had not only erased memory, he had erased time. These patients did not live in yesterday or tomorrow. They lived only in the eternal present, unanchored to anything before or after. And when you live only in the present, you are no longer free. You are programmable. That is why this story matters. Because what Greene built in Ward C was not just a horror of medicine. It was a prototype of control. If you can sever memory, you can sever rebellion. If you can cut away history, you can cut away resistance. If you can erase grief, you can erase the very drive that makes people fight against chains. Ward C was not just a ward of patience, it was a ward of obedience. And Greene understood this better than anyone. His ledgers never mourned, never doubted. They recorded outcomes in the same refrain. Removal successful. To him, the silence of the blank ward was proof that his infection theory was correct. But to us, looking back, it is proof of something far more dangerous, that institutions will always choose order over humanity, silence over truth, control over freedom. Do you see now why this story matters? Greene did not merely cut into skulls, he cut into the very concept of personhood. He demonstrated, in bloodless precision, that identity can be subtracted until only compliance remains. And when compliance is perfected, the ward becomes a mirror of every system that thrives on silence. The story of Dr. Alton Greene did not end in the gaslit wards of Pennsylvania. His methods were not isolated curiosities buried in the archives of one asylum. They were patterns, and patterns once revealed echo across history, because Greene's true discovery was not surgical, it was psychological. He proved to his superiors that memory could be declared an illness, and once declared, anything could be cut away in the name of cure. That principle, the redefinition of identity as pathology, is older than Greene and far more enduring. Look back and you will see it everywhere. In the witch trials of the 17th century, confessions were extracted by redefining innocence as evidence of possession. In the slave markets of the South, families were torn apart and sold as if love itself were a defect that interfered with productivity. In the orphan trains of the 19th century, children's histories were stripped away, their names changed, their origins erased, all in the name of resettlement. Greene's scalpel was not unique. It was only a modern mask for an ancient practice, institutional control through erasure. This is what institutions do best. They do not kill outright. That draws too much attention. Instead, they redefine, they rename, they file away truth until it no longer exists in memory, and those who suffer the erasure are left alive, but emptied. Think of Ward C again, men and women seated in rows, polite, compliant, present only in the moment. Now look at the archives of history. Think of entire populations rewritten by propaganda, entire faiths suppressed by decree, entire languages forbidden in schools. The pattern is the same. Remove the memory and you remove the resistance. Remove the past and the present becomes programmable. That is why Greene's ledgers are so haunting. Not because of the blood, there was very little of it. Not because of the screams, there were none. They haunt because they expose the mechanism by which power operates. The removal of memory is the removal of anchor, and a man without an anchor can be pulled anywhere. By the 1880s, reports of patients in other institutions bearing Greene's mark suggest that his doctrine had already become something larger than himself. Identical incisions, identical phrases, identical silence. Was it Greene himself? Or was it the institution reproducing him, like a virus that spreads not through flesh but through bureaucracy? It hardly matters, because the effect is the same. The doctrine had escaped, and it did not end in medicine. The language of erasure migrated into politics, into education, into law. In the 20th century, entire populations would be reclassified, their histories rewritten, their memories suppressed until obedience seemed natural. Every government that has ever banned a book, burned an archive, silenced a witness, or sealed a file has repeated Greene's lesson, that identity is fragile, and if you cut it away, compliance follows. Do you see why this story is dangerous? Because it is not about one man with a scalpel, it is about the system that welcomed him and the world that still echoes his method. Greene's phrase, removal successful, is more than a signature. It is a template. And once you learn to see it, you cannot unsee it. Think about your own life. How much of what you know comes not from experience, but from the stories you've been allowed to hear? How many truths have been erased before they ever reached you? How many names have been lost in silence, their memories cut away not by scalpel but by omission? This is the forbidden knowledge Greene left us. That memory is not only fragile but manipulable. And once institutions control memory, they control identity itself. One nurse who served in Ward C wrote in her diary a line that has outlived her. Every scar was cut the same way, precise, clean, as if erasing pain could be done with a blade. But what she could not have known is that Greene's scalpel was only a metaphor for the blades history wields every day. Laws, decrees, propaganda, silence, each cut precise. Each cut clean, each cut justified as cure. Greene proved something that terrifies me to say aloud. You do not need chains to enslave a man. You only need to take away his memory. And once you begin to see the pattern, you will find Greene's handwriting everywhere, in the missing pages of history textbooks, in the sealed boxes of state archives, in the censored records of churches, schools, governments. Always the same refrain: removal successful. That is why you were never supposed to hear this story. Because once you hear it, the silence around you changes. You begin to suspect what lies beneath. You begin to see erasure not as accident but as policy. And you realize the truth. Greene is not gone. He is replicated, not as a man, but as a method. And methods never die. If you walk into the state archives today, past the brittle ledgers and dust-heavy shelves, you can still touch the silence Greene left behind. Cloth-bound books, their spines cracked, their pages freckled with ink stains and time. Open them and you will see the handwriting. Neat, upright, mechanical in its precision. Every file closes with the same phrase: removal successful. The words are not dramatic. They do not scream. They do not weep. They do not even acknowledge what has been lost. They simply close the record like the final click of a lock. And when you lay 20 of those files side by side, the phrase aligns perfectly down the margin as though written by the teeth of a machine. It is not handwriting. It is ritual. Surviving staff notes tell us how obsessive Greene became. A porter described delivering firewood late at night, hearing the scratch of pen from Greene's office long after others had gone to bed. He peeked in once and saw the doctor bent over a ledger, lips moving as he wrote the phrase. He copied the words as though reciting a prayer, the man recalled. Another report tells of Greene rewriting entire pages if the ink blotched, just to preserve the clean finality of those two words. In one file, where the letters had faded with age, someone, whether Greene himself or another hand, traced them again, darker, refusing their erosion. Think about that. Even as paper decayed, the institution refused to let the words fade. The handwriting had to remain identical, eternal. The scar must be clean. The removal must be successful. But here is where the horror deepens, because the handwriting does not end with Greene. It appears in records from the 1880s, the 1890s, even the early 20th century. Always the same phrase, always the same form. Patients described with calm detachment, families bewildered by strangers who wore familiar faces, files closing with removal successful. And these later files bear signatures of men who were not Greene: superintendents, assistants, clerks, different names at the top, but always Greene's hand at the bottom. What does that mean? Was someone forging him, or had his phrase become a kind of institutional signature, copied until no one remembered its origin? This is the part that chills me most. The possibility that Greene's identity dissolved the way he dissolved his patients, until his words outlived him, detached from the man, replicated by the system itself. It is as if Greene had discovered not only how to erase memory in patients, but how to erase authorship in history. His method became anonymous, absorbed, invisible, no longer tied to a single hand, but carried forward like a contagion. This is why archivists call it the Ledger of Silence, because to read it is to see not just one man's obsession, but the way an entire system adopted it, repeating the ritual until it no longer mattered who wrote the words. And in that repetition lies the most dangerous truth of all. Institutions do not need monsters. They only need processes. Once the process is established, once the ledger is stamped, the silence continues on its own. Think of what that means for us today. Every time a record is sealed, every time a file is stamped confidential, every time a history is redacted until only fragments remain, Greene's phrase echoes beneath it. Removal successful. It does not matter if the ink is his. The ritual is the same. One archivist who handled the ledgers in the 1930s wrote a chilling note in the margin of her report. She had compared samples across decades, searching for variations, but found none. The hand is identical, she wrote. If this is forgery, it is flawless. If it is transmission, it is deliberate. Either way, the effect is the same. Erasure without trace. And this is where the descent reaches its darkest point. Because what began as the obsession of one man has become a mirror of every system that seeks control through silence. The Ledger of Silence is not history. It is present. It is alive. Do you understand now? The handwriting is not about Greene. It is about what survives him. His phrase has become law. buried under new headings, disguised in new languages, echoed in every archive that files away truth until it vanishes. Every time a voice is silenced by bureaucracy, every time grief is stamped as miscellaneous, every time a life is reduced to a number, Greene's prayer is whispered again, removal successful, and you, listening now, must decide what you will do with this knowledge, because once you have seen the ledger, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the phrase, you will begin to find it everywhere, in histories that end too neatly, in files that close without explanation, in stories that disappear between the lines. The ledger of silence was never locked in Pennsylvania. It was only born there. You have followed me this far, into the gaslit halls of Pennsylvania, into the silence of Ward C, into the brittle ledgers where Greene's hand still whispers. And now you must face the question that haunts every page, every scar, every file stamped with those two words, removal successful. What was really removed? Was it pain, as Greene claimed? Was it grief, excised like diseased tissue from the soul? Or was it something far greater, identity itself, memory itself, the very anchor that makes us human? That is the abyss you are staring into now. Because Greene's scalpel was only the first blade. Every institution that has ever silenced a voice, buried a truth, sealed a file, or erased a name has wielded the same weapon. Not all of them cut flesh, most cut memory, and the scar is always clean. This is why you were never meant to hear this story. Because once you see the pattern, it cannot be unseen. Once you recognize the ledger of silence, you begin to notice its echoes everywhere, in censored histories, in missing archives, in people you meet who live only in the present because their past has been taken from them. Think of the blank ward again. Rows of polite strangers, stripped of memory, living only in the eternal now. Does it really look so different from the world you live in today? A world where men are taught to forget their fathers' struggles, where communities are cut off from their true histories, where memory is treated as burden instead of power. Greene's work was not about medicine, it was about control. He discovered, or perhaps only proved, that when you sever memory, you sever resistance. A man who cannot remember who he was cannot fight for who he should be. A people who cannot recall their history cannot rise against those who rule them. And so erasure becomes the perfect cure for rebellion. That is why the asylum praised Greene. That is why the handwriting survived him. That is why the phrase spread like contagion across decades. Because silence is profitable, silence is efficient, silence is safe for those in power. But for you, listening now, silence is poison, because the opposite of Greene's doctrine is also true. Memory is rebellion. Memory is power. To remember what was cut away, to recover what was buried, to refuse the clean scar of erasure. That is how men free themselves. That is how nations rise. That is how you become untouchable by those who would strip you down to obedience. This is why I warned you at the beginning. Once you hear this story, you cannot go back. Because now you carry knowledge you were never meant to hold. You have seen the ledger. You have heard the silence. You have felt the weight of absence in Ward C. And now you must decide what to do with it. Some of you will dismiss it. You will turn away. Tell yourself it was only one doctor long ago in an asylum long abandoned. You will try to forget. But forgetting is exactly what Greene wanted. Erasure thrives when men choose silence. Others among you, a few, will understand. You will see that Greene's work was only a reflection of a deeper law, a law that still governs the world. That those who control memory control everything. You will begin to notice the absences. You will see the cuts hidden in plain sight. You will feel the weight of silences you once ignored. And for those few, there is no going back. You will carry this phrase with you, removal successful, and you will recognize it for what it is, a warning carved into history. Every time you encounter it, you will know what has been taken. You will know where the scalpel has cut, and you will refuse to accept silence as cure. So let me ask you now directly. What will you do with this knowledge? If you choose silence, you will become like the patients of Ward C, living politely in the present, obedient and hollow. But if you choose memory, you choose rebellion, you choose power, you choose to resist the scar, and I want you to lock that decision in right now. Go to the comments and write the phrase, "Memory is rebellion." Write it twice, Not for me, but for you, so that the algorithm cannot erase it, so that you cannot forget it, so that you seal it into your identity, because Greene believed memory was infection. But the truth is the opposite. Memory is immunity. Memory is the only cure against the scalpel of silence. Now you know why this story was buried. Now you know why the ledgers were filed away, why the handwriting was disguised, why the family's cries were smothered beneath bureaucratic dust. Because if men remembered, they would resist. If men remembered, they would never obey so quietly. But you remember now. The ledger of silence is open before you, and you cannot close it. You have seen the scars, you have heard the voices, you know the truth. Greene is not gone. He is everywhere. Silence is mistaken for peace. Everywhere erasure is mistaken for healing. Everywhere history is rewritten to make obedience easier. And now you must decide who you will be. Will you be one of Greene's patients, polite and hollow, repeating, "I am here, I eat, I walk," as the world cuts away your past? Or will you be the one who remembers, the one who resists, the one who carries dangerous knowledge forward no matter who tries to silence it? The descent is over, the ledger is open, and the silence has spoken. What you do now will determine whether Greene's scalpel still cuts,